Welcome to the Intentionists podcast, where we explore the interplay between intuition, spiritual health, and everything in between. I'm your host, Hilary Zwallen.
And I'm Aimee Schreiber. Our intention is to create a dialogue that inspires you to consciously forge your path with curiosity and compassion for life and its mysteries. Welcome, and thanks for joining us today for the first installment of our 4-part series on intuition. For this episode, we will be trying to answer the question, what is intuition? And we're going to briefly touch on how it's described in mythology, religion, psychology, biology, and discuss how it fits into our modern lives today. Why should we care about intuition? So Hilary, why don't you start us with the quote?
All right, so this is from Shakti Gawain. There is a universal, intelligent life force that exists within everyone and everything. It resides within each one of us as a deep wisdom, an inner knowing. We can access this wonderful source of knowledge and wisdom through our intuition, an inner sense that tells us what feels right and true for us at any given moment.
I think she summed it up really well.
Yeah, right? And we're done.
Right, the end.
Right.
So I think first let's just say why we wanted to start with this topic out of all of them. Why is this, out of anything, so important? And I think developing intuition, which is like in the quote, it's your inner teacher, your inner wisdom. It's basically developing spiritual and psychological self-sufficiency, meaning you no longer need to look to external authorities for your answers, validation, and self-worth. You can look within. And I think this is the goal of any spiritual practice.
Totally. I think too, you and I were talking about starting a podcast, just discussing all things spiritual. And when we were really kind of reflecting on what direction we wanted to go, this is just kind of this just seems like the best starting place, right? Because this is something that we all have within us. It's something that, regardless of your religious background, regardless of the type of person you are, we all get these, we all have that inner wisdom, and it's something that we can all relate to on some level, but there's also a lot of funky programming around that in whatever culture or society that you're in. You know, a lot of times we don't listen to our inner voices, or sometimes we're taught through whatever, conditioning by our parents that we can't make decisions for ourselves. You know, I mean, we've all met people that struggle in all different areas. And so anyway, I know for me, wanting to start with this was just like, if we can just start with a baseline on spirituality, let's just start with that personal practice of refining our inner wisdom. It seems like that's like the A at the beginning of the alphabet, you know?
Yes, I agree. Say more about like self-doubt and then like the societal conditioning that makes this so difficult, but so important sometimes.
Okay. So I think I can look at my own life, but you can see this play out with so many different people, right? Depending on, a lot of people really struggle, depending on what phase you are in your life. And sometimes this is throughout your entire life, wanting to please your parents or your friends or your community. A lot of times we're making decisions about our life's goals, work, relationships out of what we think other people want us to do and not what we really want to do, or we're not checking in with what's going on really internally. So if maybe you were raised by someone who's really controlling and so you never really learned how to make your own decisions because your mom always made them for you or your dad always made them for you. And now you're, a 45-year-old woman and you married a controlling man and you still don't know how to make your own decisions. Right. So these are things that it's like, for everyone, regardless of your circumstance, sometimes it's hard for us, or maybe difficult to listen to our inner voice at first. So, I mean, I think of my 20s, and I think that's like a lot of what our 20s are about, kind of deconstructing what our tribal culture, what religion we were raised in, or non-religion, what our parents taught us, our upbringing, our socioeconomic outlook, and how that was growing up, and comparing it to kind of what our personal vision for our life is. I mean, this is kind of the ultimate struggle of life, right?
Right. Yeah, and it takes courage to take responsibility, because when everyone's making your decisions for you, that's like the easy way, that's the lazy way.
Right.
I mean, and this really hit home for me this morning. Actually, I've struggled often with like really wanting to please people, and so kind of finding creative ways to defer my decision making to other people. And this morning, when I woke up, my son was coughing. And so I was at this juncture where I had to decide, okay, am I going to send him to school, or am I going to keep him home today? And I wanted so badly just to ask my husband, what do you think we should do? And just like let him decide for me, because it's just easier that way, but right. I really just hit home like how automatic and often I do that.
Wow.
So yeah, I'm by no means an expert in this, and I'm learning right along with everyone. But yeah, this is important.
Such a good illustration, though. I mean, like you said, it's like even having, I mean, these are things that's like a very simple day, life situation that anyone can relate to. Right. I mean, I do that often too with my husband, just like, what do you think? You do it, you deal with it. But even something as simple as that, going, no, wait, what should I do in this situation in our wisdom?
Right. Right.
That's great. I love it. How life presents us with those little learning opportunities.
I did send him to school. Yes. I made that decision all by myself.
Good for you, Mom.
Thank you.
Right. I mean, so this kind of thing can segue into, maybe you're raised by a bunch of doctors and with the expectation that you need to be a well-educated doctor. And maybe you're an artist and you want to be an actor, or you want to be a sculptor or something. Maybe you were raised by a bunch of hippies and you really long for structure, and you want, you found that going to a church is just helps you feel super happy. Maybe you were raised Catholic, but Jewish mysticism is really speaking to you, but you're worried about disappointing your parents, right? These are just, this is kind of where I think all of us in our personal path, we have a point in our lives where we're learning to trust your inner voice, kind of gives you the keys to your personal kingdom, right?
Right. Yep. Very important.
So how do we navigate our personal path when it's different than our parents, and how do we set appropriate boundaries while still honoring and loving our parents or our spouses or our community? These are the questions, right? Yeah.
Or even our previous selves. I think sometimes we set expectations for ourselves at one point in our lives, and then 5-10 years go by, and it no longer fits, but you've already made that decision and committed to that path in a different time. And so allowing yourself the freedom to do what's right for you at each stage of your life, because it changes.
Right. Totally. And that really is that's such an empowering way to go about your life, to give yourself the space that, well, of course, what was working for me 10 years ago, maybe that's not the path for my whole entire life, and to not judge yourself super harshly by that. And just kind of knowing that in whatever season that you're in, we can kind of come at what you're approaching in a loving way. Right.
So let's talk about definitions of intuition. Like, when people talk about intuition, what are some like modern ways to describe this?
I mean, I think of like the modern colloquialism, going with your gut, right? Or if you're going more new agey, it's like connecting with source energy, or connecting with inner wisdom, right? I think we've got a dictionary definition here. Do you want to share it, Aimee?
Yeah. So in the dictionary, it said intuition is the ability to understand something immediately without the need for conscious reasoning. So this is something you don't have to like reason through logically and convince yourself of it. This is just knowledge and wisdom that's there automatically.
Right. That's a really great, simple way of understanding what is intuition. But when you pluck that and you put it into life circumstances, then it gets really cloudy because we have all of this stuff that we bring. Like, I mean, how many times have you talked to the friend? And I mean, at this phase in my life, most of my friends are married and I've got kids, and it's like I'm socializing with people at soccer practice, right? But I mean, 10 years ago, how many of your friends were in relationships where it's like they knew that they were dating the wrong person, but they just were like, I don't know what to do, because they didn't want to be alone right. Or because they, right? Like those are often, I find that a lot of times with relationships, that's when we really get clear reads on what we should do, but we don't want the answer, right? We like, right. But we love them and we don't want to leave them behind because we don't want to be alone. We don't want to be a bad person, right? So it's like understanding how to kind of peel away the wants and the desires and peel away the fear of the unknown by leaving a situation that may not be the right situation for your life, you know? Yes. I find oftentimes, I mean, I see this in sessions too, where you're like, you know what you need to do here, young lady. Right. You just don't want to do it, you know?
Yeah. Anyway. I always want to just like yell from the rooftops at people who are, I don't know if I should be with him. Like, I don't know means no. Right? Wouldn't you say that's pretty good rule?
But I think even with my own self, right? I mean, I went through like 10, 15 years of dating with that as my mantra, just feeling like all I would ever know is I don't know. And exactly. And then so eventually, I mean, we could go on and on about that. So why don't we segue? I know you've got a really cool metaphor that you were going to share about this situation.
Yeah. So the way that I think about my intuition is, the Russian nesting dolls. My mom gave me this Russian nesting doll set for my birthday last year. And I just thought it was so beautiful and so meaningful because I had just been reading a book where the author was talking about them. And my mom didn't know it. So anyways, so you have this Russian nesting doll set, and the smallest doll in the center that is not dividable is your pure consciousness. This is your intuition. And when it's surrounded by all the other layers of dolls, that is your normal ego self, bound by your beliefs, your life experiences, your biases, the constraints of your five senses. And so taking all those outer layers away leaves you with this inner doll alone and unlimited. And so this is your intuition, higher self. Mm-hmm. There's no cultural perspectives. There's nothing blocking it from what is in reality. I don't know if I explained that very well.
No, you did. So the goal is, then you've got the goal is to try to get to that little doll that can't be divided, right? But oftentimes we're walking around with 5 layers of dolls, right? Of the nesting dolls around us that we have to peel away in order to get to that inner wisdom. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this series, is kind of what exercises you can do, what kinds of things you can recognize in order to develop your sense to get to that little doll inside of you that's your purest form, your purest essence.
Right. And another thing about that, I think a lot of the yogis describe truth as what is not changing. So anything that is changing is not true. And the thing that is constant, that's the truth. So if you think about like the outer dolls, those can come apart and change, but the inner one is this constant. It's this ultimate reality.
Oh, I like that. That's very cool. So we both read this actually, the women, there's a book called Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And in chapter 3, there's a Russian folktale. And you are really good at explaining this. But it kind of goes to we're going to stick with our Russian theme, the Russian doll metaphor. And now we're going to talk about a Russian folktale.
Yes.
So anyway.
So Vasilisa is this story. It's kind of like a pre-Cinderella story, I think. Maybe not really. Just
I don't
the
think she
fact that
talks about like when it originated. She didn't give like a time period. She just talked about the myth.
No. Yeah, the only thing Cinderella like about it is that this young girl, Vasilisa, has a mother who dies and leaves her with the evil stepmother and stepsisters. But before she dies, this mother gives Vasilisa a little doll that looks just like her, and she said that this is for you to help you know what to do. So it's like this little intuition in the form of a doll walking around with Vasilisa. And so she grew up, she cherished this doll, and her stepmother and stepsisters mistreated her terribly. And it was in the middle of the winter and they ran out of fire. And so they sent Vasilisa into the woods to get some fire from Baba Yaga, the old witch.
Well, and they wanted to get rid of Vasilisa. They were sick of her. And so they thought,
yes, because they were jealous of her because she was kind and beautiful, and they were jealous.
Right. Also an interesting fairy tale theme, right? The beauty and the ugliness, you know, that's the part where I'm always like, oh, okay, let's take this with a grain of salt. But yes, continue.
Yes, but that is the story. And so she goes into the woods and arrives at Baba Yaga's house and asks her for fire. And Baba Yaga has her do all these different tasks and asks her all these trick questions, which Vasilisa is able to accomplish. And because she asks her doll, she's like, okay, well, what do I say? And then she gives the right answer and is not killed. And so in the end, Vasilisa gets the fire, takes it back to the house, and the fire, when she brings it in the house, the fire burns her stepmother and stepsisters to death. So that's the happy ending to that story.
Right. But it's also like Baba Yaga is like she is like the wise crone. And in this story, she's scary and ferocious, but she's also the symbolic nature of kind of that like inner, that power and wisdom and kind of that dancing with the that internal feminine power and kind of harnessing that and being able to work with that dark matter in a way that it can be like you said, she's listening to her intuition. And so she's navigating the darkness and able to take what she needs from Baba Yaga, which is the fire and whatever, and leave the dark and scary things behind. And so I think that was also another element to the story.
Right. Baba Yaga is the initiator here, which I think is the case in most fairy tales. The witch always initiates this young princess into adulthood.
Her woman state. Right. She comes from that maiden status into that mother woman state where she becomes more wise and more cunning because she's harnessed her intuition. So,
right. I think one of the most interesting task given to Vasilisa by Baba Yaga is Baba Yaga asks her to sort these things, to separate good corn from mildewed corn and poppy seeds from dirt. So these really tedious tasks. And I think that is symbolic of learning to really discern and see things how they actually are. I think that's like one of the most important functions of our intuition. And this is not an easy thing, as we've been talking about, because when you can see reality, action is often required. You often feel the need to change your circumstances or your actions. And that's, when we allow like our deep knowing to come to the front of our mind, the pain and the injustice that we have been accustomed to and are comfortable with is less scary to us often than the truth, than this unknown change that we have to make.
Right.
And there's a lot
and oftentimes that's where the discomfort is, right? Like as that knowing and that wisdom comes in, then suddenly what was once very comfortable for you is now very uncomfortable. And you know, you have to make a shift and you have to change. And that sometimes means, literally moving somewhere. It could mean a job change. It could mean a relationship change. It could mean a a community change. You might be changing your friends or family. And so there's, like you said, things get real when the dust settles and you start to be able to notice. And so I think sometimes people really don't want to know, and they love to be kind of in that child archetype of, I don't know, what should I do? Kind of that disempowered, I never know the answer. I'm not really sure what to do. I'm just going to keep giving my power away. When deep down inside, that little Russian doll inside of them is like, you know exactly what you're supposed to be doing. And now is the time to push the fear aside and move into trust. And, and the way you go that way is by holding fast to that intuitive, lightning rod of information and that connection to your own personal, divine experience. So, you have a cool quote that you wrote down. Yeah.
Yeah. Thich Nhat Hanh explains that problem so well that people have. And one of the quotes he said about it was, people have a hard time letting go of their suffering. Out of a fear of the unknown, they prefer suffering that is familiar. Mm-hmm. And so I think all the themes about darkness that happen in these fairy tales and myths are, the darkness doesn't symbolize something bad or evil. It just symbolizes something unknown. And everyone has to step into the unknown to truly grow and like discover things for themselves. I was just reading something that said, like, if you can see the path ahead of you, then it's not your path.
Interesting. That's something to contemplate for sure. Yeah, I love all of that. I completely agree. Alan Alda had a quote too. At times you have to leave the city of your comfort and go into the wilderness of your intuition. What you'll discover will be wonderful, and what you'll discover is yourself. I like that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Right. So shall we segue into intuition in religious and historical settings?
Yes. Intuition is talked about in most religions and many stories. Like, this is the still small voice that's talked about in the Bible. I think it's in 1 Kings, with the story of Elijah, where he's listening for the Lord, and it says, the Lord is not in the strong wind, earthquake, or fire, but is in the still small voice. And other traditions, what is it called, Hilary? What are some other ones?
Oh, so like Buddha nature, higher self, true self. Like contemporary, sometimes we refer to it as like our Jiminy Cricket, our conscience. Sorry. The light of Christ. In Hinduism, they refer to it as your true essence. If you're into Star Wars, it would be called the Force.
Right.
Your divine self. In contemporary psychology, I've heard it talk about the right brain. I was reading, so this week it's getting to be closer. My kids were wanting some Halloween books. And so I went to the library and I was looking for some Halloween books, and I stumbled across this mythology section. And in the mythology section, there was a book on ESP and on shamanism. And I was like surprised to see this in the children's section. I mean, this was like in the children's nonfiction in the children's sections at the library. And so like historically, there's a lot of, now contemporarily, we've got like palm readers, and there's intuitive readers, there's shamanic practitioners, there's energy healers, there's all kinds of stuff that happens. But I'm always like, where did this come from? Like, where was this, like, how did this evolve, and where did it evolve from? Right. We know that there was the New Age, right? And that was kind of, in the 90s, it was like all the self-help. The New Age was kind of in the 70s. And I would say that there's still a lot of New Agey stuff going on. You could still consider it New Age. And then before that, we had the spiritualists, and there's still some of that going on now. But in this ESP stuff, this ESP book that I read, they were talking about how in the 1800s there was this resurgence. So in the Renaissance, they had magicians and astrologers and sorcerers.
Alchemy was really big.
And alchemy.
Right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And also, so that was kind of a resurgence in the Renaissance that happened. And it goes way back, thousands of years before the Egyptians had all that stuff too. many different empires kind of had different forms. The Greeks had all of that too. But as you move through to more modern times from the Renaissance, then there was the Enlightenment, and that all kind of fell away. It was like, nope, science, guys, this is all nonsense. So that's done. Well, then there was a resurgence in the early 1800s of kind of magic and ESP, and people were really interested in kind of this supernatural phenomenon. This is in the, the early 1800s. There was the Mary Shelley books that were written about Frankenstein. And anyway, so this was all kind of happening in the historical context of the Western world. Was ghost stories were becoming more popular in literature, and people were, even Abraham Lincoln was said to have, that Mary Todd Lincoln was a spiritualist, and they would have, that they were visitations in the White House. There's some of those stories that you can find that are interesting. And so in the early 1900s, there were actually scientists that were studying ESP and telepathy. And so there's that kind of psychic phenomenon side of things so from there, it's kind of been integrating into more of that blending the old with the new and spirituality, and taking kind of these religious contexts and plucking from them things that are interesting and good, and kind of swirling them into this Eastern Western spiritualist mishmash, which kind of gets us to where we are today. I hope that's not a completely confusing, like,
well, that was a good timeline.
3-minute historical timeline. Going off of hopefully that's helpful. I'm sure that there are certain things that I'm not getting completely accurate, because I'm going off of like memory from all of the stuff I've read in the last 3 years. But yeah, so that kind of brings us to where we are. Obviously there's been, intuition has been referenced throughout religious history for millennia. Depending on the religion, though, there are very strict kind of confines to what is appropriate intuitive development and what isn't appropriate,
Right.
And again, that religious or that historical synopsis that I just gave doesn't really go into the kind of the pagan uprising and neo-paganism. So there's a whole bunch of stuff there too. And I don't want to discount any of that. But like I said, was a very short, brief rundown. So anyway, why don't we move into the biological context? Aimee, you can take us into that.
Right. So we have two sides of our brain. We have our right hemisphere, which is our spatial, visual, emotional awareness. This is your big picture creative thinking. And then your left hemisphere is your mathematical mind. This is sequential. It deals with language. It's very detailed oriented. And I was reading that your right brain evolved first and is more active during dreaming, and your left brain is a little newer and more dominant in your waking life. So I was thinking that maybe when we are referring to our intuition, what we're really doing is trying to access our older, wiser right brain, because it's so connected to the creative tasks, and the people in their dreams get intuitive messages. And so in these two, in these two hemispheres, like, they're actually different modes of consciousness. There are two different consciousnesses, if you can imagine. I was just reading, what was it? Oh, it was a Sam Harris book, Waking Up. He gave the example of a split brain study where a child patient, they used to do this for people with epilepsy. They would cut the corpus callosum, which is the band of fibers that runs between the two hemispheres. Mm-hmm. So they would cut it. So for this kid who had his corpus callosum cut, they asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. And so his right brain, which is connected to his left hand, pointed to a race car driver. And then his verbal left brain said he wanted to be a draftsman, just like someone who draws things, or architect or something. And so I thought that was so fascinating. Like, these two brains had two different agendas. what does that mean? I don't know.
I know. We need to get Sam Harris on here to tell us about it. Wow. Yeah, that's something to think about. That's like, no wonder it's so hard to be inside of your own brain. Like, we've got all these, we're wired for the conflict, right?
Right. Well, we truly are. And it's wild. It blows my mind. This concept was really heavily discussed too in another book by Gary Lockman. It's called Secret Teachers of the Western World. He talked about the evolution of the right brain and then the left brain and how it affected societies at large with regard to their spiritual teachings.
I wonder if you looked at like American society, if it would be more left brain dominant or right brain dominant, you know, like if you were to take
definitely
a sampling.
Left brain.
Do you think?
I mean, I think left-brained people are rewarded financially in our society.
Yeah, but I think agreed to a degree, because I think of like the people that are like the wealthiest people in America are like tech entrepreneurs and, you know, largely very creative, big picture thinking people, you know? Now,
well, yeah, you're right. So that's both.
Like,
then
there's obviously the foot
both.
soldiers, you know, like once you get into that corporate America, there's like more cogs in the wheel, like more specified, like you have the accounting department and the finance department and the marketing department. And so people kind of fit into that, and that maybe that's more left brain. I'm not sure. Something to,
I think you're right. I think the people who are wildly successful, like the real change makers, those are like right brain
visionaries.
People.
Yeah,
yeah. But we are bred to operate in left brain society, like
to be more of a foot soldier.
In school. Yeah, I think that's probably how it goes. Hopefully, it's changing. I don't know. We need both for sure.
Yes. There's good for both. Okay, psychological context.
Yeah, talk to us about the ego. Like, this is all right. This is a word that is thrown around.
Yeah, yes, and it is. It's kind of everywhere.
And what does it really mean?
So the way that we kind of throw it around in modern times is the ego is kind of like your bravado. It's your negative voice in your head. It's your judgment. It's like your judgmental voice in your head. And it's the thing that we try to transcend kind of in the new age spirituality place. It's like, let go of the ego and connect to source energy and bring in love. Right. So that would be the ego that I'm talking about. Right.
Right. Yeah. I've heard it also described more as, something that's not necessarily negative, but just something that's more limited.
I like that. I like that better. Yes. Because I feel like I think that is a better interpretation of it. But I feel like if I look back at my initial introduction to what the ego was, it's a pejorative term. Right. It's like, oh, he's got so much ego. He's such an egomaniac. She's an egomaniac. Right. The ego is not. Right. So it's like, that's pejorative. But if you think of it, like, I like your perspective, because I think that's really more of what it is, which is it's just a limited way of thinking. It's your limited belief, that it's your limited voice in your head that's telling you can't go down this path, or you shouldn't go down this path. Right.
Right. And it's your personality self versus your true self.
Right. And there's also kind of that collective tribal ego, and that consciousness that is kind of in groups. And then there's also that stuff that's that negative self-talk, or that limiting self-talk inside of yourself. So this is something that you can start to examine your awareness during like dreaming. So our dreaming self and our waking self are usually not aware of the other. I would say for me, I have had more lucid dreams in the recent, like the last few years, than I ever had in my life, where I'm dreaming and I'm aware that I'm dreaming and I'm like, ooh, I should remember this because I'm dreaming. Whereas before it was always like, oh, I'm dreaming. And then you wake up and you're like, oh, that was a dream. Thank heavens. Right. So, our ego personality self is kind of the left brain, and it can become more aware of the unconscious self, that more right brain. So I think that's my
Yeah,
I hope that makes sense.
No, yeah, that's an interesting the concept of lucid dreaming is a really interesting illustration of the bridge between the two sides of the brain, or between your intuition and your personality.
I like that. And how it can meet in in the subconscious or unconscious states.
All right. Have you ever read the Malcolm Gladwell book called Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking?
I don't know if I have. I know I've read Outliers and another one. I don't know that I've actually read Blink, though. Tell me about it.
Blink was fascinating. He talks about split-second instinctual decision-making. So basically intuition. And he said, in the book, he said, our world requires that decisions be sourced and footnoted. And if we say how we feel, we must also be prepared to elaborate on why we feel that way. But we need to respect the fact that it is possible to know without knowing why we know, and accept that sometimes we're better off that way. And there can be as much value in the blink of an eye as in months of rational analysis. Mm-hmm. So this is, everyone I think has experienced times where they just knew something without being able to explain it. And in the book, there's a lot of good examples. I think the first one he gives was sculpture. And a woman looked at it, and right away she was like, that's a fake. And everyone was like, no, it's real, and this is why. And they did all these studies on it. And eventually, I think it was maybe years later, they realized that, oh yeah, this actually was a fake. How did you know it? And she said, I don't know, I just did. I could just tell right away. So, yeah, really.
People have those experiences, I think, all the time. And often we discount them as, oh, it's just something. It's nothing, but it is something.
Yeah. So learning to trust yourself becomes the main challenge here, right?
Right. And I think really, when you think about moving into a business setting or moving in, like, depending on what you're dealing with in your current life, like maybe it's that you need to divorce your spouse, or maybe it's that you need to break up with whoever you're with. Maybe it's that you're feeling the birth of a new job coming, or a new career, or you're wanting to start a business and you're just kind of scared to take the leap. But it's these times where you really have to follow, what are these hunches you're getting? What are because once you kind of get into the flow of, and you honor that inner voice and that inner wisdom, you do get more and more and more of it. Right. And I think it's because we clear away our own clutter when we honor ourselves and we have integrity in what's going on inside of us. Right. So I wanted to segue this into those moral attitudes around developing intuition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is acting authentically, acting in line with your values and intuition is going to create optimal situations in your life, because it's what's authentic for you. And it's those times when you're being most honest with yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And those, and I think it's also creating, when you start to tap in and become aware and mindful, and you start to create mindfulness practices around your inner wisdom and around your intuition, then you can start to do things with more pure focus and and your intentions for what you want to create, where you've heard in some of this new agey stuff, the laws of co-creation, like how you can really co-create your reality. Well, then it can happen because you're actually looking at your life with clear eyes and with clear purpose. And so when you start to align with your intentions and like, what do you really want to create? Not what do your parents want you to create, or what does your spouse want you to create, or what kind of person are you expected to be in your certain circles or at your job, then you can start to really manifest what's coming, what you want to manifest in your life. Right. So that's where we bring intuition into how that works for us today, right now.
Yeah, it's really stepping in to your power.
Right.
And taking responsibility for your life, for who's in your life, for what you're doing with your minutes in your day. And I think we're going to talk more about this in a later episode as part of this series. But there are a lot of ways to develop your intuition, a lot of activities and meditations you can do. And the point of all of these things is to really, like you said before, clear the mental clutter. You're not trying to teach your intuition to be wiser. You're trying to teach yourself to access what's already there. This wisdom is already there. It already exists. And so when your mind's quiet and your body's relaxed and you're free of anxiety and not being pulled this way and that way by your emotions, that's when it's easiest to hear the voice of your intuition. And so that's why meditation becomes so important.
Right.
And anything that trains you to focus.
To be still, to be quiet.
Yes.
And this could be thought of as prayer or just engaging in kind of that. I think a lot of times I view my meditations as kind of a dialoguing with the divine. You know, like I'll sit in silence and I'll say my prayers in my mind, but then I'll also wait and listen. And that's something I didn't do as much before. I did a lot of just kind of talking and begging and pleading, please let this happen for me, whatever. And as I've grown and aged and matured, I've really seen the value in sitting quietly with my inner voice and knowing that the right thing will come when it's supposed to, and the right answer will come when I need it to be there. Aimee, do you want to talk about how we develop our intuition just briefly? Because I know we've got a whole episode, like our next 2 episodes, we're going to be talking in depth about how you develop your intuition. And I know you talked a little bit about quieting your mind and meditation, but I'd love for you to elaborate.
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to begin is just set aside moments of each day to close your eyes, take some deep breaths, quiet your mind, and actively try to listen and observe and accept like what is going on around you at this moment. And then you can ask, what is the ideal action that I should take next today? And then just listen for the answer. Like I think we know what to do in any given situation. We just sometimes don't want to do that thing because it's hard or uncomfortable or whatever. But if you really quiet yourself and turn off the little chattering distractions that surround us in our modern lives, then things really start to become clear. And pay attention to like any feelings, any hunches, images, words that come to you and throughout the day. And also we mentioned, and we'll talk more about it, you can pay attention to your dreams, write them down. And so practices like that. Anything else?
You covered it. I mean, that's the majority of it. I wanted to just share a brief experience. Like if we're going to talk about, I know we've kind of touched on this episode about how intuition can benefit your life, your safety, your relationships, your business, and to know really kind of when it's time to move on in a relationship or in business. You know, intuition is usually really strong here. Right before your life starts falling apart. You know, at least in my life, I feel like you sometimes get hits, and sometimes that can be a little bit scary, but I found that in my life, at least when I've had those feelings of like, oh boy, a big change is coming, that it's always for my highest and greatest good. It's not, I mean, there may be some tragedy and there may be some deep disappointment, and I may have to really deal with emotions around loss or grief or shifting or changing or whatever that may be. But that at the end of the day, when you honor that inner voice, you're always brought to that place that's for your highest and greatest good. And so there really is no need to fear. I think one of the biggest lessons I learned in intuition happened in my 20s. And this was one where I had a relationship with someone for a while, and it wasn't very healthy, and it was isolating. And I started, it was the first time in my life I started having full blown anxiety attacks, like all the time. And he would like lie to me about the dumbest things. And I would and he was probably lying about big stuff too, but I thought that I was like a crazy person. And I noticed that, and he was kind of talking about like, look at how crazy you're being with this anxiety and all that. And I knew in the back of my mind that I had never done this with anyone else before, and that my body was kind of picking up on the lie, and it was triggering all this funky anxiety. And it took me such a long time to realize that that was my inner awareness telling me that this person was not being truthful, or that person wasn't right for me, because at the time I really wanted this person to be right for me. I think about that experience often because at this point it's been, over a decade, and I don't have any hard feelings or anything towards this person anymore. And in fact, I look at that experience as one of my greatest life lessons. I think, my gosh, my body was telling me exactly what I needed to do in that moment. And I didn't want to listen to it because my head was saying, no, you need to be doing this. So if there's anybody listening that is in a situation like that, and you're getting those feelings where maybe you're acting out of the ordinary and you're feeling like maybe there's something wrong with me, like really take a look at what is your inner voice saying to you that is causing a physical manifestation of anxiety or fear or the inability to function, because there's usually a reason behind it, right?
Right. I've been in similar situations, and I've found that looking back, any time where I began to feel like I was literally crazy, it was because I was being crazy by ignoring my intuition, my strong,
yes, and that's a good point
sign.
too, because I probably was being crazy too. Not, there was that, but it wasn't who I was, just like you were saying.
Right. No, it wasn't. It was because you were ignoring what you knew, like deep down. Had you stopped, or correct me if I'm wrong, like in my past experiences, in times like that, I was actively trying to busy myself and convince myself of things that were not true in order to avoid the painful, ending of the relationship, for example.
Yes, absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. I think that's something I hope everyone can relate to on some level, those feelings of and those are the matters of the heart are always the hardest,
It is. They are.
They're always the hardest because what it does is then it brings up the fear of, will I ever be lovable? Will I always be alone? If I leave this person that I know is not good for me, will I, so there's all those feelings that come up. Same. And it goes for job or career. Like, if I leave this job, will I ever be employed again? Will I ever find, and it's really hard to know in the moment, because oftentimes, like you said, if you can see the path and maybe it's not the right one, like sometimes we have to go into that. We see the path and then the lights are out and we know we have to just walk into the darkness and trust our inner voice and our inner wisdom to take us through to the other side, So anyway, I just thought it would be good to leave today with a little personal experience. Shall we give a little assignment before we head out?
Yes. So this little assignment, just find an object or an image. It can be physical or imagined, to symbolize your intuition. So something that you can think about and say, this is my intuition. It can be the Russian nesting doll. It can be a crystal. It can be a candle flame, a seed, or whatever you want. Do you do this, Hilary? Do you imagine your intuition as a physical object?
Sometimes I do. I feel like it just depends. Like especially in the beginning, I would do visualizations where I would go kind of up to a safe space in the center of my head, and then I would just be there with kind of my inner wisdom. Now it kind of manifests in all different ways, but yes, I think it's a great way to start, especially if this is a new thing for you, where you're like, I'm interested in this, but I'm not really sure what to do. It feels very safe when you're just connecting with yourself, because I know there can be a lot of fear in the concept of like when I first started meditating, I remember being like, am I going to be are there going to be bad spirits jumping in here? Is this a scary? There was a lot of scary lore from my upbringing and from just fear around doing something that was foreign to me that made me feel scared, even though it was the most pure, it was just such a pure thing to want to connect with the divine in that way. So yes, I feel like if it's something where you're just getting started, then to visualize a wiser, more, grandmotherly figure of yourself, like your future self or your higher self, then that can be a really great way for people to connect.
Yeah. So choose this object or image or person and visualize it and sit and meditate with it. And as you're sitting, imagine your limited perspective dropping away, and then until you're left with only that pure essence. So all your fears are just falling away. I kind of like to imagine them dropping into the center of the earth and getting burned up.
Oh, I like that.
All like the limitations and fears.
Use the magnetic force of the earth to just suck it all out of you. Yes.
Yeah. And then just listen and record any thoughts or feelings that you have. You can write it down or type it on your computer.
And really, you can just sit there for a minute or 5 minutes or 20. There really is no time frame. If you're just new to sitting still, it can be very daunting just to sit for 1 minute at first. So just breathe, and you can do that.
Before we part, we'd like to say thanks for listening, and we hope you'll connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. We would love to hear from you and appreciate all feedback, shares, and likes.
To learn more and subscribe to our newsletter, visit Intentionists.com. And no matter where you are or what you're creating, we send you love and invite you to breathe and begin.
See you next week.